Greetings. My colonized name is Audrianna Goodwin, and I'm a Truth Project researcher. I also am the Tiwahe specialist for the Red Lake Nation, and it's an honor to be here with you all to be talking about our research that we've been doing for the past few years.
Yes, so hi again, you all. I introduced myself earlier, but just to go over it again, my name is Anne. I'm from Bois Forte. I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, and I was the university coordinator for the Truth Project. And my current role is as research programs manager at NAC, which is the Native American Community Clinic, here in Minneapolis on Franklin. And I may sit down just for accessibility issues, so pop up and down. So first, we just wanted to begin with some stories of this land. So this is a place nearby here called Bedote. Bedote is the Dakota place of creation. We are on Dakota land. Dakota author and educator Ramona Kiddo Stately teaches us that before settlers arrived, the islands around Bedote were islands of reproduction. So that's where Dakota women would travel to give birth. We really like to center this because, as you'll see through our presentation, the University of Minnesota was built very near to here and very deliberately as an act of ethnic cleansing. And so, let's see here. So, sorry, going back and forth. This is a map that shows two places very central to Dakota cosmology. So, Owamni-Amni, which is today known as, what do they call it?
St. Anthony Falls?
St. Anthony Falls. I always want to say Father Hennepin. He was the missionary that came. And Bedote, which also is very near to where they built Fort Snelling, which served as a concentration camp to Dakota people after the War of 1862 and before they were exiled beyond the bounds of the state.
And so this is just showing the 11 federally recognized tribes that are currently within the boundaries of Minnesota. And so further north, we have several Ojibwe communities, and further south, we have several Dakota communities, but also wanting to recognize that there has been multiple peoples within this area for thousands and thousands of years. So the Dakota, the Ojibwe, the Ho-Chunk, the Sac, and the Fox. And so it's really important to understand that history as well, because a lot of our stories of creation, they really mirror and intersect with one another. And even as we were walking through the door into the presentation space, there's this really cool thing on the wall. I don't know if people have noticed that, but it's just like expressing that, you know, we come from the stars, we are star matter. And so that's also something that we as Indigenous peoples have known forever, is essentially that we were sent from the stars. And so modern day science is, I like to tease and say that it's just catching up to what we have known for generations and generations. And so for us as Ojibwe people, our oral history goes back at least 15,000 years, and that's just what I know, right? And so there are other people that are knowledge sharers and cultural holders that that goes even further back. And so it dates to the Ice Age and to the glacial period here as well. And so for us Ojibwe people, we have a long history of migration. And so we were told, prophesized to travel to the place where food grows on water. But in addition to that monomen, that sacred wild race, it was also the black bear, the strawberry, and the blueberries. And so those things are really present here in Minnesota, and then even further north, like into Canada and stuff like that. I know like areas even of Wisconsin, you know, they don't have strawberries, but we have strawberries here. And so that's also a little bit more to that story. So it's not just, you know, the monomen, it was all of those things. And again, that oral history that was passed down is still here, still very much alive. And we're in this process of reclamation. And yeah, so I just wanted to briefly touch base on the differing Indigenous groups of people that share geography with Minnesota. And then the Truth Project research was done with just the present day communities, recognizing that there are communities that were exiled. So several Dakota communities were exiled after the Dakota War. And so that's also a parameter or a shortcoming.
It's a shortcoming to our research design.
Yeah, yep. And so I just wanted to briefly talk about that.
All right, and then we just want to take a moment to situate ourselves today in relation to this land. So this map was made by Dakota artist Marlena Miles, and it teaches us the names of all of the locations in Dakota language for what we have. So up there in the top left corner is Badeota Otunwe, or Minneapolis. And we are here today in Imanijiska, St. Paul, what we know it as today. I think that if we discuss here also for a moment that M right there in the middle stands for the University of Minnesota. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the U was built in a place that was very central between two places of Dakota cosmology. And author Jim Rock describes this as a reflection of the Milky Way. So up and down this river valley, you will also find burial mounds, because this is where folks were buried near the water. The spiritual aspect of this is that the river serves as a site where the spirit world and the earthly world intersect. And so the early founders of the university knew that, because they had a long history in the fur trade, and they had close relationships that they had built with Indigenous peoples of the area, and exploited those relationships and the knowledge that they had learned in order to steal Indigenous lands.
And then I just want to add as well the significance of the water, not just to us as Indigenous peoples, but to all peoples. So that water is that first home inside of our mother's belly. And so while we're also inside of our mother's belly, it's 3 generations or even 4 generations, I think they're saying now. So just wanting to take a moment to recognize that significance. Mini Wachoni, Minowa, Nibib, Minobimadizi, when water is life. So that is in Dakota and Ojibwe. And so you'll also too recognize that, the waterways were essentially, how we traveled. And so really, again, playing a very, very significant place within our communities, within our societies. And you'll see that connection, right? You see that shining through when we're talking, when we're out in community. There's so much emphasis on that water. And so again, it's a process of reclamation. So there's a lot happening within the city of Minneapolis, the city of St. Paul. Marlena Miles and the work that she does is an example of people stepping into spaces and reclaiming those spaces, putting our indigeneity in them.
And so our research story actually begins below this very river, which is the same river that you see out of the windows. The plaque that is visible here is on the entrance to the University of Minnesota archives, buried deep below the river. The entrance is in the Anderson Library over on the West Bank campus in Minneapolis. So they brought in these giant machines back in the 90s and excavated 400 million tons of rock and sandstone from below the banks of the river. And when we go down there, there's a shaft elevator that you go down about 6 stories and then walk through rows and rows of shelves, basically 3 to 4 football fields in length that travels up and down the river valley there, where the University of Minnesota campus sits today.
And then when we were preparing for coming to the Science Museum and the presentation that we have today, realizing that there is also archival spaces here below the surface of the ground, deep inside the caverns. And so, yeah, just really wanting to share. Interesting.
Okay, so before we go into our research methods and process, we just want to give some foundational language that we can work with. So you'll often hear us refer to regents. The regents, or the Board of Regents, are the governing body of the University of Minnesota and have been since the university first opened in 1851 as a federal territorial institution. In 1862, the university received funds through the Morrill Act, federal legislation, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and was designated a land grant university. Land grant means that it was dedicated to agricultural pursuits. However, you'll hear us often say land grab, and we refer to all of the land grants that the University of Minnesota received as land grabs because they were often taken through violent and coercive means.
And then one more thing about the regents, they are appointed by the governor, and so there is an intersection of the state legislation within that realm of the University of Minnesota and their governing structures, and they also are quasi-sovereign, and so that was something else that the University of Minnesota wrote in their constitution when they were creating it all, and so what that means as well is that they have their own police force. They have the ability to basically say the state patrol can't be there. So for example, after the riots of George Floyd, the murder of him, there was a lot of stuff going on, and so that was something that the University of Minnesota did, was essentially said, we're the ones that are going to be making sure that the University of Minnesota is okay. So just wanting to highlight that there is that intersection within the state legislation, and so really also the intersectionality of the federal government and all of these kind of policies as well is really a central part of the Truth Project research.
All right, so I spoke to this a little bit in that brief introduction that I gave before the circles met, but 2020 was really a year of reckoning here in Minnesota and in Minneapolis more specifically. At that time, as I mentioned, there was the first ever senior leader that had been hired by the university in the institution's 171-year history, who identifies as Native American. He is also a member of the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa, where I'm from. And since then, he has been appointed to be the first regent, Native American regent, and that's a appointment by the governor to fill a seat that was vacated for a short time. He then again ran and was selected by the entire legislature to fulfill a full 6-year term. So this is the first year of his 6-year term. When Tad came into his position, and we created a proposal for the Truth Project, the university really didn't want anything to do with it. Surprise, right? So what our goals were at the time was really to write, for the first time ever, a history of tribal university relations from an Indigenous perspective. And so we brought it to the controller's office, we brought it to the president, we were told again and again, there's no money to fund this project. We began to take it to outside organizations who said, this is a really good proposal, but in order to change systems, the system has to be included. Where are they? If they're not investing in this, unfortunately, we can't either. And so it just so happened that, as I mentioned earlier, a group of professors was applying for a $5 million grant through the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation called it would eventually be called Minnesota Transform. They funded many different projects through that, and several Indigenous projects, including the Truth Project. All of the Truth funding that we received from them, which amounted to about $480,000, was subawarded to the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, a state entity that's comprised of 10 of the 11 tribal leaders. And they then dispersed it equally to the 11 tribes, who had each appointed their own research fellow to tell the story of their community's perspective. When we went into the project, there were several things that we really wanted to make sure of. One, we did not want the university to be able to appropriate our story or our research findings. They did not want to engage in any of the project, but you know that once everything is done, they really want to say that they were there doing that good work, and that's just not the case. So we'll talk a little bit about how we subverted their communications people a little bit later. Truth was really designed to move at the speed of trust. Our communities know that the University of Minnesota has not been the benevolent benefactor of gifts of land that they have long claimed to be, that there was another story. We just didn't know the specifics, right? And so when we started to look into the beginnings of this, we didn't really have any goals besides to uplift Indigenous voices, to center those voices in the retelling of these narratives. The tribes were not given any mandates as far as how they were to show up, what type of deliverables they had to do. So basically, yes, they could have just taken the money and ran if they wanted to. Which I think is what SPA or sponsored accounts at the university thought was going to happen, right? You know, you give BIPOC folks a bunch of money and you have to really micromanage how they spend it. You know, that $100 cost to get snacks for a meeting might be under a little bit more scrutiny than that $10,000 meal that the science department had a little bit ago, right? So we were really forced to subvert a lot of university structures, and luckily the team at Minnesota Transform was really helpful in allowing us to do that. In fact, in their subawards to the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, we made sure to create a data sovereignty clause, which said that the university does not own the data. The university does not own the story. The tribes own this story. That was really important because later the university tried to come in and force us to hand over some of our data in the middle of our project. And we really had to fall back on those clauses in order to keep that from them.
And I think that's also a really important distinction as far as the funding goes, because the University of Minnesota, you know, it appears that they were really this supporting kind of entity with the project, and that's really not the case at all. And so again, right, that's that co-opting of the narrative, and also wanting to recognize that we spent a lot of time, a lot of unpaid emotional labor went into this project, and you can't even begin to quantify, right, that emotional toll that all of the researchers had when they were in the archival spaces, when they were uncovering, you know, these stories of trauma and harm. Again, right, the specifics of that story of that harm, because like I feel it. Right, I can feel it sometimes. Sometimes I'm able to be abstract, but then other times it's like, whoa, right? It's like it's just like a bodily response, right? It's like that fight, flight, or freeze kind of feeling. And so we endured a lot of that during the past few years. And so again, right, we weren't compensated to the extent that we should have been compensated, but we continue to champion through, we continue to get over the hurdles, and we were able to publish the report a year ago, and really have seen a lot of movement, a lot of around the research and wanting to share that story, people wanting to get involved. So yeah, the University of Minnesota definitely wasn't as great of a partner as they could have been.
And so originally our project was designed to run for 1 year. However, working in community, we can't follow institutional timelines. So our project ended up taking 3 years. The first year, we spent moving at that speed of trust. We went to communities, we visited reservations, we visited with tribal leaders in order to explain our intentions with the project and really design that intentionally and thoughtfully alongside community who had the final say in everything that happened. Our final report was over 550 pages long, published on April 11th. It was a Native-led, Native-organized, Native-driven project with primarily Indigenous researchers. So Truth really used a braided mixed methods approach that was action-oriented in line with Graham Smith, who is an Indigenous academic from Aotearoa or New Zealand, really describes the need for us to be action-oriented and not just to do projects for the sake of learning. So we were really steeped in relationality and designed this mixed methodology to expose the systemic racism that was at the root of the University of Minnesota. We blended tribally led research. Often tribal research fellows were working in community, working with their elders, working in their own community's archives, and would travel into the city to visit archives either at the Minnesota Historical Society down the road here or at the University of Minnesota. We blended this archival analysis with a Western economic analysis through forensic accounting that determined a valuation of the land that was taken through multiple land grabs. We really wanted to take cues from the land, recognizing that it's not just the people who have been harmed by the university, it's also the land. And what happens to the land happens to us. So we really centered our research in a place-based methodology that honored Indigenous epistemologies.
And then for the land valuation piece and the forensic accounting, coming into the project, we also had an understanding that we needed to be able to talk about what was happening in a way that the Western world understands. And so the way that the Western world understands is that power of the dollar, right? And so capitalism, profits, revenues, all of those things. And so that's why we had to take that focus as well. And that's why there's such a big emphasis on that permanent university fund. And when we're talking things, right, that's something that, again, right, people can understand, especially in that Western world. But again, it doesn't begin to quantify that disconnection from the land and the body. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the health disparities that our communities experience today. And then one more thing for the archival research, we had a really great relationship with the University of Minnesota archivists, and we were able to host a 1-week training as well to kind of start the project off. And I don't know if you want to add anything about the 1-week training.
Yeah, I will. Okay. So our metrics of success for this project were were again designed in relationship with the community. So first, we really wanted to make sure we were using culturally relevant research practices, that data sovereignty protection that I mentioned, that the research methods being used were appropriate. We learned very early on in our project when our tribal research fellows began to disengage and we couldn't figure out why, that we needed to offer spiritual and emotional supports to them. So we went back to our funders with Minnesota Transform and said, look, we've already subawarded all of our funding. However, this is really hard work for our research fellows, and the emotional labor is so taxing that they're disengaging. Would it be possible to get extra funding that we could put aside for some of these emotional and spiritual supports? They went back to the Mellon Foundation. Mellon said, yes, you can use monies for that. So we set up a system where our tribal research fellows, or really anybody who was on the Truth Project, was able to go see a counselor of their choice. And then that counselor would bill Minnesota Transform without letting them know who the bill was for. So again, subverting these typical processes at the university that want every detail about every penny spent, right? And they then would pay that bill. We were also able to pay for a spiritual advisor for the entire project who would bring our team together every so often and just kind of work out some of those things that we were embodying, that we were carrying with us, that we should really be setting down and leaving where they were. And that was a Lakota elder, Lemoyne Lapointe, who works locally here in the Twin Cities with organizations to do a lot of strategic planning and other projects, and works closely with the UN on the Indigenous Peoples Forum. Second, we wanted to center and uplift. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Yes, please. Sorry. Is this, I don't know if you're going to get into this. If you're like, just pull your heels, tell me. But I'm like completely stymied by the fact that you were able to figure out a workaround for how they really want to see every nickel and dime and account for that when it comes to any grant funding in general and funding, overall. So I'm wondering, did they ask you to write something new? Like, how did you even accomplish? Because that's a huge. I'm sorry. I'm like, no. Whoa.
Specifically for the emotional and spiritual support.
Yes.
Yeah.
So congratulations. That's amazing.
Yeah, it really was amazing, and it really was helpful, and really, I think, showed our researchers how invested we were, right, in them. Not in getting the research done, right? We wanted to make sure that they were taken care of. And so we did have to write a short proposal to include that. It was less than a page. And again, I'm going to take that back to the point in time that we were at. I don't know if you all have heard this term, but Audrianna and I went to the Humphrey School of Public Policy, and they often said that the influx of money coming in to local nonprofits at that time was coined the George Floyd effect. There was so much money coming in. We were also right in the midst of a pandemic. There wasn't as much watchfulness, I would say, or maybe even people were just more understanding, right? And so that taught us, right? You can be understanding. You can make exceptions when you choose to. And so I think that has been our biggest takeaway, one of our biggest takeaways, right? Is this work can be done in a good way, even though institutional policies and practices oftentimes try to stymie that effort, that we can do things in a good way, and folks can. There are workarounds. There's always loopholes. And it depends on who knows how to get through those loopholes and if they're going to help you come after them. And so really finding a sponsor, right? So Minnesota Transform was committed as well, right? So those faculty members were also committed to not just carrying out a research project, right, but really to being in good relation with our communities. And so they went to bat for us a lot. Just the process of getting the MOU sent out with tribal sovereignty clauses took months. Our project started about a year later than it was supposed to because it took so long for that subaward to get to the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council so that they could hire somebody to coordinate the tribal side of the project. So our actual research started in 2021 rather than in 2020 when we were given the initial grant. Does that help? I know it's not like real specific or anything, but I think that we were at a moment in time that showed us the possibilities, and I know they've tried to close that window, right, on those possibilities. And so what Audrianna and I have been doing over the last year is kind of like sticking a stick in there, right, saying, no, you can't slam this on us because we know what you can do. Did you want to say something?
Yeah. Also, too, for far too long, systems have told us what was best for our people, and that's not the case. And so we are also in a time, where we are standing up. We are using our voices to speak against these policies that just don't work for our people. And so this is, one example of what that's happening. And so for my role that I have for the Red Lake Nation, we get unrestricted funding to be able to do project areas. And so this model of, allowing people like us to be able to say, this is how we're going to spend the money. We need this, 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 and this, it's happening, right? And so we just need to continue for all of us, to use our voices, advocate for that less restrictive funding, right? Because again, we know our communities best, and there's all of this research, all of this, that points to that, right? Again, we know our communities best. And so the Truth Project, we were able to tap in, right? We were able to find the right connections within the departments to be able to have those hard conversations, right? We need this, and we need your help to do it, right? And so that's also, a part of it. We're not just like saying these things because we want to say these things, right? We're showing vulnerability because we want things to change. And so, we stood up and said, nope, this is what we need, and we're going to figure out how we're going to do it. And if you guys aren't the ones to be able to fund it, well, we're going to go somewhere else, and we're going to figure it out, because there is a partner that is willing to be able to, remove that white tape. I like to say white tape now, not red tape. Okay.
Yeah, and so third, we had a commitment to collective learning. So as Audrianna mentioned, when all of our tribal research fellows came on, we had a kickoff week where Native faculty from the 5 campuses of the University of Minnesota came together to train our research fellows on whatever methods that they wanted to learn about. We did that via Zoom because at the time we were in lockdown, and so that that was another hurdle we needed to overcome. A lot of our communities closed, and we were not able to visit as we typically would to build those relationships. So again, central to all of this was that relationship building that was being done both with faculty within the university and to our partners on tribal nations and in urban indigenous communities.
And then one more thing about the collective learning as well. So the archives are based here in Minneapolis. And so for our communities that are further north, it's really hard to be able to come to the city, right? To be able to just to come into these kind of spaces. And so that's also another point, right, to consider as we're discussing these things. And also as well, most of the tribal research fellows are tribal employees. So the tribe was then supporting, this work, this Truth Project research. And so, we did it, right? Our team, our people, we came together and really kind of, bringing those concepts of the past, or those concepts and values that got us to this today, and really reinstilling that, right? That collectivism that our communities had is really, really powerful. And so being able to do this research together was very profound. And it was an opportunity even for us as communities who haven't always gotten along with one another to be able to come together on something, a shared value, a shared goal about being able to tell this history of relations from an Indigenous perspective.
And then finally, I'm sorry, did you have another question? Okay.
Feel free to chime in. If there's comments, questions,
Yeah.
great. Yes, please.
I just have one quick
Yes.
question.
Yes.
The permanent university fund, is that the same as the endowment?
Yeah, it's part of it. Yeah, and we'll get into like how that process goes and how the money flows in a few slides here, because it's pretty interesting. And it flows up. It doesn't flow back to our communities. Spoiler alert. So we wanted to also, our fourth metric of success was being able to widely disseminate our message. We didn't want the university to take ownership of this, to co-opt it, or to silence it in any way. We want to be very clear. We're not the first researchers to talk about this. We encountered many, many articles in the archives that discussed presentations, symposia, conferences, protests that happened over the same knowledge again and again throughout the years, and the university was able to shove it under a rug, use their PR machine to quiet all the press and, you know, smooth things out, and it went away. There came a time where we went rogue. So we after our research was completed, we held a symposia because not all of our tribal research fellows wanted to include a written report. So we offered a space where they could come and present in person. And this was held at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And they were able to share their findings and their recommendations to university leadership who showed up. Again, the two Native leaders showed up, and the president came for 15 minutes, insisted on speaking and interrupting somebody's presentation, and then she left. But she was in full partnership with us. She wanted us to know. And so we were, in August of 2022, we were suddenly left without a boss. Tad, who was our boss at the time, as I mentioned, was nominated to be a regent. That meant he had to retire and quit everything related to the university. He was the advisor for my master's thesis. He was our boss. He was leading this project. The university did not appoint anybody to step in and lead this project after Tad was off of it. So Audrianna, myself, and Misty Blue, the MIAC coordinator for the project, decided that if the report was going to be published, if this was going to be done, we were going to have to do it. At that point, we were out of funding. We had nothing left. So it was really just sheer will of three single moms to make this happen, right? And we ended up taking everything off of the university servers that had to do with our research. We enlisted the support of the Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Minnesota that has a long history of public engagement, public scholarship, and public protest in support of communities, students, faculty, and staff who the institution continues to marginalize. Their communications director obviously knew how the structure of communications worked at the university and used her connections to begin to let outside reporters, investigators, news organizations know that this report was coming out. We were able to form relationships with local media who were waiting to receive a press release upon the completion of the report. And they ran with it. So we were able to achieve that metric of success through many presentations, news articles, and interviews. The University of Minnesota was not able to co-opt this narrative.
Yeah, No, just that was just so cool to be able to publish the report in university. They didn't know nothing about it, right? It was like that morning we like had it all set up, blasted the press release all over, and then we saw widespread all over international news as well, China Daily, UK Daily, like it was the buzz, right? And it was just so awesome to be able to, work through all of that, right? Going through, the lapse in leadership, not having funding, like what do we do? And then to be able to pull it together and publish the report. And so that was just amazing. So, all right.
All right, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit from methods, and we'll discuss some of our findings. So my research, that was part of my master's thesis and makes up the core of the university portion of the Truth Report, looked into the role that the Founding Board of Regents played in Indigenous land dispossession and genocide in order to found the university. These historical figures are men who buildings, towns, schools are named after today. Henry Sibley, Alexander Ramsey. We're seated right here in Ramsey County, named after the one and only Henry Rice. And all of these men held very powerful positions in government, either as the governor of the territory of Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, U.S. congressmen, state and federal Senate and representatives. Most of them were also wealthy business owners who used this information to not only make the university rich, but to make themselves even more rich. They were able to really leverage their conflicts of interest to cherry pick the lands that they deemed would earn them the most profit. So this background here, I know it's kind of hard to see, is a ledger book that we found in the university archives in the Pillsbury papers. Pillsbury, yes, Doughboy, he's also a central figure to this story. This ledger was made by the state's geologist, who took a team and methodically took a survey of every section of land that would come to be known as Minnesota, and what was residing upon that land at the time. And so we've seen very, very early on in these ledgers that they would refer to this section of land has a nice stream that's adjacent to a large stand of white pine that would easily be able to be logged and build a railroad, right? Just 6 years later, when the same men were discussing similar parcels of land, it became no longer, was there a stand of white pine. There were 6 million feet of lumber available to be harvested. So those tree relatives were already dead in their eyes, right? They were already monetized, and they were waiting to capitalize on them. They would make deals with local businessmen in order to sell off of these parcels of land, even prior to the point where it would be accessible to be harvested, because folks knew that eventually a railroad would be going through there. Henry Sibley and Alexander Ramsey both were heavily invested in the railroad industry, and we'll come to see what role that played. So because the University of Minnesota is such a world-renowned facility for research, the university has really been able to carry this narrative of what they say a land-grant university is. This revisionist narrative really obscures the role that they played in the genocide of Indigenous peoples here in Minnesota Makoche. And at the same time that these men were sitting on the Board of Regents, they were also making decisions, entering into treaties with Indigenous nations that were often coerced or under threat or duress. They would also then go on to really just choose the lands that were given through the federal government based on these ledgers that they had at their disposal. So they often chose areas that were heavily wooded with tall trees. They chose areas that had access to minerals that they were interested in. My community, Bois Forte, was relocated by the university 3 times. The first was in an attempt to just settle us on a reservation. The second was because the university's geologist falsely identified gold on the shores of Lake Vermilion, which is the lake that we had lived upon for centuries. And we were relocated to Net Lake, which is where the reservation sits today, but we kind of straddle both sites now. Within just a few months, that was found to be fool's gold, and really the whole forced treaty and removal of Bois Forte was unnecessary and unfounded, and left the tribe in such a state that a special treaty had to be made with what they called Chippewa at the time, or Ojibwe peoples, because of the extreme poverty that we were living in, as they took away our access to food, sustenance through hunting and gathering, despite the fact that our leaders at the time had guaranteed through treaty that we would reserve those rights to hunt, fish, and gather on all ceded territory. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I would like to emphasize, these men that we're talking about, particularly Alexander Ramsey and Henry Rice. They were also, the treaty negotiators. And so, there was a lot of harm, a lot of, not so good things that were taking place during this period, the mid 1800s. And so one other tragedy that happened was the Sandy Lake tragedy. And so it was the Ojibways were asked to come to receive their annuity payments. Alex Rice or Ramsey had devised this plan that the Ojibways were going to come get their annuity payments at the beginning of fall. And so at the beginning of fall, it's not a good time to travel. And so we were going there to get our annuity payments, rations, meat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when we arrived, the meat was spoiled. They didn't have the money. And several hundred Ojibways died from starvation. And so there was a lot of tragedy that was taking place during this time. And it really wasn't until we started to dig into the archives, started to dig into these particular men, that we started to see the connections. Like, wow, this is really interconnected. And so again, it's not just here in Minnesota. These men had connections, heavy connections to, the East Coast and other senators and presidents and, all of those things. And so through the research, really starting to see, just how malevolent and the extent of what they did to be able to accomplish that.
So this is a sketch of the first site of the University of Minnesota, which was actually located a little bit upstream from where it is today, at the base of the falls, St. Anthony Falls that we mentioned before, Owamni, that place that's so critical to Dakota cosmology. The reason is the falls generate power. They really wanted to harness that hydroelectric power, in just a few short months after these buildings were built, the university was asked to relocate by friends of the institution, who turned out to be Pillsbury and his friends who wanted to open the mills. So Minneapolis is known as the Mill City, because right on the edge of those falls, they built all the mills because that hydroelectric power was able to run all of the milling operations. The university would move downstream it sold this land to developers to develop their mills, made more money off of this land. But the story of how they got this land is really interesting. We found out because it turns out that the person who had originally laid a stake on this land was also a founding regent, and at the same time he was also serving as the Master General for what they called the Fort Snelling Reservation. So back in those days, the military had to stay on a reservation. Our ancestors were free to move around as they always had. This Postmaster General intercepted letters stating that the land was going to go up by the federal government very soon, and he did not put this section of land on the maps. It remained unmapped, and so he was able to go in the middle of the night and put his stake in that land. And then the next morning, when all of the parcels went up for sale for claims, he had already had this one that they had already identified as being the most profitable land along the river because of these falls. Did you have something?
Yeah, I just so if we apply to what they were doing during this time period today, that would be inside trade, inside secrets, all those things, and people go to jail, for those kinds of things. And so, wanting to, right? It's not good. Anyways.
So you see why the university didn't want to part in our in any of our project. So this is just a general timeline of the founding of the university. So in 1851, the university opened as a federal territorial institution and received its first land grab by Henry Sibley and other signers of the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. By 1857, there was an act calling for the creation of the state of Minnesota from the territory, and that act passed in 1858. However, by 1860, the university was closed due to financial mismanagement. The Board of Regents had mismanaged the funds from that first land grab so severely that the legislature had to step in and begin a long process of installing an emergency financial board. Who do you think sat on the head of that emergency financial board?
The same person that ran it into?
It was Pillsbury. Pillsbury came in and said, "Oh, I can fix that for you." Pillsbury had ulterior motives because there was a bill that was beginning to go around the U.S. House and Senate calling for land grant institutions to be created throughout the country. From all of this land that the federal government had just, received or found. And so the university was able to reopen later on after they received that. However, in the meantime, several laws passed that really benefited both the university and its early board. So it was the Railroad Act, the Homestead Act, and the Morrill Act, all in 1862. And within just a few months of those acts being passed through legislation, the government of Minnesota announced war on the Dakota people. The result of that war was exile of most of the Dakota tribes from all bounds of the state of Minnesota. Alexander Ramsey was governor at the time, also sitting still on the Board of Regents, even though they had mismanaged it so badly. These same men were allowed to continue in their position on the board. Henry Sibley was appointed Brigadier General. It was his job to, quote unquote, track down all of the Dakota people and drive them beyond the bounds of the state.
And then those same laws that drove the Dakota out of their communities are still on the book to this day, right? And so we see this pattern, not just like here in Indigenous communities, right? There's patterns all over of these really horrendous laws that, you know, genocide, murder, all of these things, and still on the books today, right? And so that's why looking to the past, uncovering and tending these roots of the institution is so important, because without knowing the true history, you know, we're kind of just like running with our heads off, right? But now we know. And so through knowing, you know, we're able to, again, right, one of those metrics of success of truth is to widely disseminate the messages, because people just don't know. Yeah.
So what this research suggests is that the University of Minnesota was built as a shell corporation, right, to funnel in stolen lands and money and resources from Indigenous peoples, and served as a point of transfer from Indigenous peoples to the settler society. Today, the University of Minnesota has 5 campuses across the state. They have extension centers in every county and boast 2.1 plus million square foot of research space. We have not been able to completely map all of the land that has been expropriated by the University of Minnesota. However, we have begun to. Did you want? Okay. So this map was done by one of our research fellows. We enlisted the help of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, who did some GIS mapping for us of the parcels of land that the University of Minnesota stole through its multiple land grabs. And so I know this is a little bit difficult to see, but the red indicates current land holdings that the university still has, and the blue was granted to the university through the Morrill Act. Now, what might not be visible and kind of runs along that line that is just south of St. Cloud in Minneapolis is that was primarily Dakota territory. So all of that blue that was taken through the Morrill Act right after the Dakota were exiled was Dakota lands. Now what we discovered was they were taking the profits that they were making from those areas up in red, Ojibwe lands, to fund that war against the Dakota people. Did you? No, okay.
So again, right, wanting to be able to make sense in a way that other people make sense. And so that's why this land valuation is so important. And so the Permanent University Fund is a fund that was created at the establishment of the University of Minnesota. And what it was meant for is to benefit the university in perpetuity. And so that perpetuity is a really important key word in all of this. And so doing through the research, what that means in perpetuity is that essentially it just needs to be on the books. So there really is no way for us to quantify exactly how much revenue this account is unless we had those financial statements. And also another really interesting part about the project is that it was really hard for us to get some of the data. So we did do data requests. We did ask the University of Minnesota for some of their financials, and of course we didn't get them. And so we had to continue to dig and dig and dig and dig, right, on all of these like websites to be able to get these files. And so for 2000 and 2022, the total PUF amount, which includes mineral leasing, timber, land sales, royalties on iron ore, etc., was $918 million. And so again, right, that $918 million, there could be or there could be just invested in various multiple ways. And so once that money is invested, then it's able to become discretionary revenue for the University of Minnesota. And so it's just like astounding what this one account is able to generate for the university specifically. But this isn't the only account that benefits the university and also the state of Minnesota. There's also the Permanent Swampland Fund, the Permanent Salt Spring Fund, and then the Permanent School Fund. And so the Permanent School Fund is also another big fund. That one's $120 billion. And that fund benefits, the K through 12 public education system. Again, our tribal schools are left out of that distribution ratio. So that's what also this research aims to do, is to be able to divert these funds so that they benefit the tribal communities where the resources are being extracted from. We can go to the next slide. So iron and taconite mineral leases from 1880 to 2022, this is not adjusted for inflation. This number here, that's just a base number. So if we adjusted that number for inflation, it would be, again, astronomical. This is on the low end, right? So this is just the leases, the royalties that are being generated from this land. That's not accounting for the sale of the iron ore. That's not accounting for what they're making off the top, the companies that they're leasing this land to. And so again, right, that's just astronomical amounts of money. When we as tribal nations, we receive very minimal funding from the federal government, very, very minimal funding. And so, we have to fight for scraps. We have to fight all the time. We have to compete against other organizations because that's just the way the system has been created. But when we know that there are these accounts that are this large, like, let's tap into it. You know what I mean? Let's finally do some wealth redistribution so we can uplift the most marginalized people. We can go to the next slide. So the University of Minnesota also then directs their permanent university fund profits to the Minnesota DNR, which also is kind of like an interesting relationship because the Minnesota DNR manages the lands. And so that's also kind of how the university is able to like shimmy their way out of the conversation, kind of not admit responsibility. But there definitely is a connection between the Minnesota DNR and the University of Minnesota. So 80% of those permanent university fund profits go back to fund administrative costs for the DNR. That's not to say that the DNR isn't making progress. So for tribal citizens, we're able to, get access into the various state parks for free. We can get the 1-year pass. And so that's just one example of, where the DNR is doing an okay job. And so again, right, the Permanent University Fund is meant to hold the proceeds from the sales of the land and resources extracted from all the land granted to the state. Through this research, we didn't know coming into this exactly what we were looking at, but then we started to see the numbers, right? We were digging at the archives, looking at these old ledgers, like, what does this mean? I'm not an accountant, I'm not, and so it was definitely a learning curve. And we had to, again, deploy our resources, our networks to be able to ask those questions. Well, what exactly does this mean? And so we were very, very thorough on really all the aspects of the truth report and all of the findings. So we can go to the next slide. So this is one example of that circulation of wealth from the PUF. So they were able to bond the monies from the PUF. So again, right, that in perpetuity piece. So this is just one example. It's a smaller amount, $3,400 in 1956. But what they were able to do with this money is that they were able to do capital investment, capital infrastructure, roads, highways, jails, hospitals, schools, really whatever they wanted to do with the money. And so then again, right, I think this one is a 3% interest or 4% interest or something like that. But again, that interest then becomes discretionary spending for the entire state. And so this is just one example. They've been doing this bonding from the Permanent University Fund since at least the 1880s. I think that was one of the first examples that we had. So really, again, pointing to what this fund did for the state of Minnesota, right? It built it up. And again, tribal nations, our water infrastructure is absolutely horrible right now. Our tailing ponds, our sewage ponds, it's really critical, again, that we open up these funds so tribal nations can have access to it. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
So that was a lot, right? That was just one portion of the Truth Project research that really looked into that institutional genealogy, that traced that money, right? You want to know what a
25,000%.
25,000% was their return on investment.
25,000%.
There's no comparison that can be made to that type of ROI. It's indescribable. I think the closest that the economists that we worked with were able to come was the 90s .com boom. Did not make as big of a return on investment as the University of Minnesota did from the theft of Indigenous lands and resources. So
I just want to, and so that's also then how the University of Minnesota was able to set themselves apart from other land grab universities is through how much they were able to make on this return of investment. Like when you compare it to Cornell and to UC Berkeley, when you're comparing it to these other places, what the University of Minnesota did and how they established the policies to be able to create these revenues in perpetuity is astounding. And you really start to see again, right, this transfer of wealth from Indigenous communities. And so to Anne's point, the Truth Project, there's a lot in it. And so we're not even able to touch base like on all of it, like that 25,000% return on investment that just like came to me, that there's a story map, a really great story map. We didn't get to include it in this presentation. So really wanting to encourage you guys to go to the Truth Project website, interact with it, download the reports, share the reports. And so I'll give the mic back to Anne to talk about misplaced trust.
So after the Truth Project concluded in 2023, we had a lot of questions still, right? We had more questions than we had answers. One of the biggest ones that we had was, well, how is the university still profiting from mineral extraction on trust lands? And so the author, lead author and editor behind the original Land Grab University article, Tristan Atone, approached our team and said, we would like you to write along with us. We got this huge data set. So they were able to purchase through a grant from the Pulitzer Center a data set that has information about every parcel of land ever sold by these land grant institutions, and the ones that they still hold and what is happening on those lands. So Maria Rose is the data analysis person behind this amazing set of data. If you visit this QR code, all of the data is freely downloadable. The complete story is there. And they really just put it out there because this is how the Truth Project started, right? They just freely give people their data and you write your story. You know, we're not going to write your story for you. You know your story best. So we were able to take that data, and that's how we started to track the movement of money through the University of Minnesota and the state. So the second article came out earlier this year through an independent news organization called GRIST, and it was called Misplaced Trust. And it looks into the resources that are continually extracted by land grab institutions through these mineral and taconite, sometimes foresting leases that universities still control. Oh, wrong one.
And so, you know, we're talking about Minnesota and kind of think that these are astronomical numbers. No, like these other places, like for example, Washington State University, New Mexico State University, I think they generated $1.2 billion in these revenues from the land that they took from the Indigenous peoples there. And so what Misplaced Trust does is it just starts to really map out how big this actually is and how much revenues are actually being generated from these state trust lands. Again, these institutions are kind of being able to shimmy because the DNR or their Department of Natural Resources are the ones that are managing the land, right? And so they'd say that, oh, we don't have nothing to do with it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, really, when you read the article, look at the data set, right? Like the information is there, and we're now able to start leveraging some of this stuff even here in Minnesota. So for example, the White Earth Nation is currently looking at getting the White Earth State Forest back. And so I did share this resource with the chairman. You know, we at Red Lake, we're working on some lake back issues as well. And so this data set that accompanies this misplaced trust is a resource. So please share this resource with people because, you know, with our background as public policy students, now alumni, right? Research informs policy. And so that's why this is so important. Again, right, widely disseminating our messages, connecting all of you guys here, right, today to listen to what we have to say, to be able to take that back to your communities, take that back to your friends, to your relatives, to your children, and to talk about this. Because, you know, we need more voices to help amplify what really actually happened. And again, right, that almighty dollar. Well, our communities could really use some investments. And so this is one way that we can shift and make those investments into our community.
So the question before was about how the money moves through the PUF or the endowment. And so this article really starts to dig into that. So this is an infograph or a series of infographs that are available through the article also. But at the time of the University of Minnesota's founding in 1851, the Board of Regents established what we now know as the Permanent University Fund, which is the nest egg of what would become the endowment of the University of Minnesota. The Permanent University Fund holds money from land sales and resource extraction and is designed to support the institution in perpetuity, and that is encased in law through the 1862 Morrill Act. If that ever needs to be changed, the Morrill Act needs to be adjusted. So the first major cash injections into the PUF came from the sale of those Morrill Act lands in the late 1800s, and that was a total of approximately $579,000 adjusted for inflation. All Morrill Act lands were sold by 1904. The university no longer holds any lands associated with the Morrill Act, and that was a stipulation of that law. So in the years since, the fund has been fed mostly by this revenue of extraction, right? Extracting resources, extractive industries. In Minnesota here, that's been primarily iron and taconite leases on state trust lands. Up in the northern part of Minnesota, we have what is known as the Iron Range. My grandma grew up in a small town outside of our reservation by the name of Hibbing, where her family had been relocated so her dad could work in the mines. So my family has been relocated multiple times due to extractive industries and other things by the University of Minnesota. So since 1890, when mineral rights on trust lands were first leased, so prior to 1890, the University of Minnesota, when they sold those lands, was not keeping any rights to the subterranean mineral leases. They were selling everything. Once 1890 hit and the Board of Regents started to realize that they could make even more of a profit through mining, the university began to sell these parcels. However, they would retain subterranean mineral rights. The purchaser would only be purchasing from the ground up. The PUF since then has accrued nearly $154 million in revenue from mining alone. And then, as Audrianna mentioned, that money is invested, right? So between 2018 and 2022, just for that 5-year period, state trust lands produced almost $16 million in revenue for the Permanent University Fund. That money did not make it back to our tribal nations, nor is it invested in Indigenous initiatives at the university itself. And after amassing that interest, the money grew to $42.5 million for the university, because we know, right, they have this very specific quotient that they use and processes for maximizing their return on investment. So in 2022, the PUF was valued at nearly $920 million. And this comes from the university's own data set, the annual report that they give to the legislator. That money represents 1/3 of the total endowment of the university. So just from the continuing extraction of resources, both on and off tribal lands, the university continues to profit and continues to grow their endowment exponentially.
Well, I guess what I have to say leads into this, I guess. So as you know, we're talking about this money, I feel it. It's like, again, right, that feeling that I was sharing earlier is just like anger, disbelief, hurt, sadness, all the things that our people experience to get here to this point, how hard we had to work to even get our master's degree, right? And so it's like, wow, right? It's just wow. And it really just like takes me aback because it shouldn't have to be this way. Where we are with technology, where we are with the advancements of society, you know, this just shouldn't even be like a conversation, right? Our people shouldn't have to live in the harm and the traumas that we do. And so a little bit more about myself is I do direct services within my community. So I'm with relatives that are actively in addiction. I'm with relatives that little babies that don't have their moms or dads because they overdosed on fentanyl. I'm in it, right? And so like, it's not like an abstract thing. It's like, no, like these are my people. Like this is very much like who I am, right? It's very much a part of me. And so that's why, again, right, this research is so important because through this vulnerability, through this sharing this story, a shift, a change needs to happen somewhere along the way. And we do that collectively, collaboratively. So just so grateful that you all chose this presentation, this session to come and listen to what we have to say. So I'll let Anne transition into the next slide.
So the University of Minnesota, in addition to its monetary endeavors, also has a long history of research-related violence against Indigenous peoples. And the university really continues to root itself in epistemological hierarchies that place Western knowledge at the top and Indigenous knowledge far below that. Especially when it comes to who gets to know, learn, write about, disseminate knowledge, right? And for those of you who aren't from Minnesota, our rates of education for Indigenous peoples is sad. There's about a 34% high school graduation rate, and less than 2% of us make it to any form of graduate degree. So when Audrianna says it takes a lot to get that master's degree, it's because you're constantly fighting against these currents, right, that are rippling out from the institution. And while Truth Research backed this up, previously a native Hawaiian scholar, Knuckamali researcher by the name of Randall Aki, drew the correlation from how many times folks who are from the White Earth Reservation here in northern Minnesota were relocated to the rates of homelessness being experienced by Indigenous peoples today. Just a few miles down the road in Minneapolis, we have a large homeless population. A lot of our relatives are houseless right now. Audrianna, as she mentioned, is working in community in Camp Ninokazi, one of the encampments in Minneapolis, of which there are several. At NAC, the Native American Community Clinic where I work, our clients are predominantly Native, low income, and many of them are experiencing homelessness and addiction. And we are actively trying to heal from the harms that were caused and that are still rippling out from 170 years ago. And so I'm going to pass this to Audrianna, and she's going to discuss her specific research from the Red Lake Nation. I just want to give you all a warning that it is quite bleak. Take care of yourselves as you need. If you need to leave the room, feel free to leave the room. Take care of yourselves in whatever way is necessary.
So as Anna had mentioned, I was appointed by the Red Lake Tribal Council to be the Tribal Research Fellow for the Truth Project. And so back in 2018, prior to moving to the city of Minneapolis, we became aware of this issue that I'm going to be talking about. So there was a Dr. William Freeman, his name was. He had came across documentation in Indian health records that discusses the research that took place on young children in my community during the 1950s and the 1960s. So you can go to the next slide. So the first nephritis outbreak, some of the key findings from that, again, 1953. From this study, the researchers find that an injection of penicillin would cure the disease. So acute glomerular nephritis is a disease of the kidneys. So it typically starts with like a staph infection, either like on the skin or within the throat. And so for us at Red Lake and for the children that got this disease, most of them were from the throat, the streptococcal infection from the throat. And so during that first outbreak, there was a child that died at the age of 2. In addition to a child dying, researchers find that an injection of penicillin would cure the disease. And at that time, the medical doctors provided injections of penicillin to 70% of our population. So it's important to note, though, however, this was at the tail end of the outbreak. So just wanting to make that point. So again, there was a first outbreak of nephritis during 1953. And it's also really important to note too, as well, during this time, many of the people within my community were still Ojibwe speaking. So the caregivers, the grandparents, the one that had authority over the children, they were still Ojibwe speaking. And so when we were digging in some of this historical documentation, we came across some video footage from 1949 where you could visibly see that the women were really uncomfortable, right? They didn't understand. This is our first interaction with, like this mobile health machine. They were looking at tuberculosis because we didn't do medicine that way, right? We didn't have those kinds of things. We gave birth in the lodge. We had, our traditional plants, those kinds of things, right? And so this was very new to us when we experienced this at that time. And so really relying on Western medicine to be able to help us, right? And so that's where kind of this injection of penicillin comes in. And then the research process was very intricate. They were very, very interested in acute glomerular nephritis. So this is at the time, when we're learning more about bodily functions, there's advancements in the medical field. So they sent these samples from Bemidji to Minneapolis for further testing, flew those samples. So again, right, just wanting to highlight the investment that the institution was willing to make to be able to study this disease and our children. Go to the next slide. So leading into the second outbreak, this is again kind of interesting. The University of Minnesota was already involved in contract negotiations to continue to do medical research related to nephritis and acute renal cardiac disease. So this is in 1964. So this is 2 years before the second outbreak of nephritis. So it's just kind of really interesting that they're already kind of in this space or in this thinking to want to study the children of my community. Go ahead, next slide. Whew. Okay, so during the second nephritis outbreak, again, the University of Minnesota was already there doing field research as referenced by the contract that was signed in 1964. They were visiting every 3 weeks to both the Red Lake Indian Reservation and the Leak Drake Reservation. What else happened then a couple months later is when the second nephritis outbreak came to be. And so the nature, location, and extent of lesions were recorded, and the parent, if available, or the child was specifically questioned regarding hematuria and other manifestations of acute nephritis and also of acute rheumatic fever. If clinical or laboratory findings suggested the existence of acute nephritis, patients were hospitalized at the University of Minnesota hospitals for more thorough evaluation, which usually included percutaneous renal biopsy. So the point in which that I'm wanting to highlight in this one is right here. And the parent if available, or the child was specifically questioned. So throughout these outbreaks, there has been an issue of consent. And so there is more research that needs to be done to be able to fully explore that. But we'll go to the next slide. So these are just some more of the key findings. Really, what I want to highlight and emphasize, during this is just the role of the kids. There was a image that I had came across, and he was a boy like laying there, and you could see the lesions on his skin. I didn't include it in this presentation, but our community is so small that that I knew who this child was. Right, just by the last name, the beginning letter of the last name, right away I knew. I was like, okay, this is this family, this family, this family, or this family. And so, as I was doing this research, it was very emotionally burdensome to know that researchers from the University of Minnesota came to my community. Again, from the research findings from that first study, penicillin can work. Well, they decide, actually, we're not going to treat the disease. We're going to study the disease instead. And so, even for myself, right, my little guy, he's 6. So they were, doing that research on little children like that. And so I think that's also really, right, it's heinous to be able to do research like this on children during the 1960s when it was far more brutal, right? They didn't have the X-ray technology to be able to identify the kidneys,